over there with the Army Corps and some of the rebuilding efforts in Maui. I thought that was really interesting. But we have Stephen with us. Stephen, if you can, give us your name, who you're with, and what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. My name's Stephen Ambajis. It's a funky Greek name, try and say it once or twice, and good luck with that. But yeah, no, I'm with a company called Air Data Solutions, and we're an aerial mapping company, but I actually started a mapping company out here in Hawaii back in 2008 called Resource Mapping Hawaii.
Okay.
And yeah, and then subsequently merged with this bigger company on the mainland, and yeah, there you go.
So 2008.
Yep.
What motivated you to start that, and what have you been doing since?
Well, it's a fun story. You're gonna love this, man.
That's why you're here,
right? Yeah. No. So I started out kind of as more of like an academic. I was actually working for the U.S. Geological Survey in Hawaii, or on Big Island, and had come over to Hawaii to try and help them figure out how to map invasive species. Actually, because I have a degree in forest science.
Okay.
And
what are some invasive species?
Oh, bro, there's so many, man. Yeah. So the biggest ones here that most people know and hate, at least in Hawaii, are this one big tree species called albizia. It's a big emergent species that dominates the canopy. It shades everything else out, and then it's got a really nasty habit of breaking apart under high wind conditions and then clobbering everything underneath it. So it's really nasty. It's mean. Yeah. It's really exciting.
Incredibly invasive and then immediately not structurally sound.
Yes, exactly.
It's a great combo.
Yeah, everybody loves it, man. Actually, we had a hurricane a series of years ago, and because it dominated my neighborhood on the Big Island, it was like very small hurricane actually, but took down all these albizia, and it took us a week and a half to cut ourselves out of our neighborhood.
Oh,
everybody out there with their chainsaws, bro. It was intense, man. Yeah. Anyway, yeah. So, but
where does that come from? Is that why I had to? Is that? I mean, the invasive species in general. Is that why I have to fill out a form before they let me off the plane?
That is exactly the deal. Yeah. And so, Hawaii, as you know, now that you've been here for half a minute, it's the most beautiful place on the planet, and we have probably every eco zone you could possibly imagine, right? Except for true tundra, right? So if you go uphill, 14,000 foot on Mauna Kea, and depending on whether the dry side or the wet side, you can be in a true rainforest or a true desert. You can be, you get all these eco zones, right? So everything that gets to Hawaii loves it here because it's 70 degrees all year round, man.
Right.
And there's food everywhere. And so if you happen to be a plant or an animal, you will find the place that you enjoy, and you will procreate forever and ever.
So no snakes, right?
Is that what? But no snakes.
No
yeah.
Snakes?
Yeah, we're working really hard to keep the snakes out because it has a tendency to kill all the birds, right?
Yeah. I lived in Florida a long time, so the Everglades has massive issues with all like the pythons.
Yeah, invasive snakes. Yep.
Okay, right. So you started mapping invasive species, and then you said, "Hey, you know what? I just want to start a company." And
yeah, no, absolutely not, man. Yeah, no, I didn't. I have zero business capacity or knowledge. I mean, now I've got a little bit, but no, I was working USGS. We developed a technique. We were trying to use satellite data. It wasn't working out real hot for a whole bunch of reasons that may be obvious to some people. But basically, it's really cloudy here all the time.
Yeah, that's the first thing I thought about was cloud cover.
Yeah, so it's tough to get good satellite data. Not only that, but at the time in 2008, your resolution of satellite wouldn't be all that. It wasn't that great necessarily. And then on top of that, you'd only had maybe 8 bands, right? If you were working with, QuickBird or whatever, right? And so it just didn't happen to be enough data to really distinguish between these different species. And so we decided we were going to try some aerial approaches. And what it was really is interesting is that we were trying to take, we're going to use all the newest approaches, right? Because all the technology is developing all the time, right? You got all these different sensors, all these different bands, it's like, oh yeah, it's great. Except that it turns out sometimes the old school approach actually works better than the new school stuff sometimes, right? So in our particular case, because of the complex diversity in Hawaii, we had a better time trying to map invasive species using phenology, meaning how plants look, as opposed to like some spectral signature, right?
Really?
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely. And so we kind of hunted, right? Because what we did is we went back to what people have been doing, 50 years ago, taking images and then doing manual interpretation of images. And so what we realized is that if you collected really high resolution data, you could give a giant high resolution data set to a botanist, and then they can, instead of walking through the forest, you know, where it's really, really dense, you know, rainforest, for instance, and then, you know, and then potentially really mean topography where you were going to have a hard time getting around anyway, they could just go ahead and make polygons around all these, you know, different forest canopy species, right? And that turned out to be really, really useful. And even though, again, it was kind of an old school approach to a big problem, it worked. And so, again, I was working for the U.S. Geological Survey, their research entity. And so once we had kind of come up with this approach, they were like, the Nature Conservancy and the state was like, okay, great. You know, we got to implement it now. You know, let's do it. We want to do it all over the state, right? And but they're a research entity, and so they were, well, who's going to do it? Well, there was nobody here, no survey company that was here ready to do it. And so they're like, well, hey man, you want to start a business? You know, we'll funnel you some contracts, you know, and I mean, I still had to, you know, compete, but there was nobody to compete against. Right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And we'll give you, you know, we'll give you some seed money. The Nature Conservancy gave me some seed money. And so I bought a plane and a sensor and started mapping as like a 2-man show for
wow.
years. Yeah.
I'm so sorry, but he says seed money. He's talking about invasive tree species. It's like so many dad jokes.
Bad. Right? Yeah, I'm sorry to say that, man. That's horrible.
So what was it like in the first few years? You know, a 2-man show. Was that the glory years, as some of those guys call it? Because it was, life was easy and then it grew, or was it harder and then it got easier when you got to people?
Bro, that's a horrible question. I mean, it was never easy. Let's just say that it was always the hardest thing ever. But it was really, really fulfilling. Right?
Okay.
So like we were getting stuff done. We felt really good about what we were doing. We were also in the process of trying to go broke all the time because we were being asked to do probably the hardest thing you do in the survey world, right? So anybody who knows anything about aerial survey, you know, it's already a risky business anyway, right? It's really tough to predict, you know, weather conditions in any particular spot. And then we're going to fly in Hawaii, which is probably one of the most complicated places to fly on the planet, right? Just because of weather and topography and all these things, right, that make it really, really hard, right?
With really expensive equipment.
Really expensive equipment, right? And then we were not flying down around the residential areas down near the shoreline where it's like manageable, right? We're like up Mauka, you know, up in the middle of these, you know, valleys that have, you know, 1,000-foot waterfalls, beautiful, right? But as soon as you lose an engine or something happens, you know, where the cloud layers come in, it's just like, oh, sorry, too bad, you know. And so it's like, it was spooky, man. It was really, really spooky. But again, fun and rewarding and all the rest of that.
Okay.
And yeah, it was cool.
That's amazing.
So I have to ask, so fast forward to today's time, everybody wants to use machine learning and AI to do this automatic classification routine, effectively taking your manual classification, you know, method and then using computers. Good, bad, and different.
Yeah, no, and it's absolutely the way to go. I think the really confounding factor, and anybody who's played with this and spent any real time trying to understand how it works, what you find after a bit of time is that there's times when it works like a charm, man. It's like the best thing since sliced bread, right? You put in a bunch of training data, right? And then you push the button and it's like, yeah, man, this is awesome. And then the other half of the time you're like, oh my God, this is so stupid.
4 times the amount of effort just to use what you have instead of going. So the big question is, do you just then revert back to the old school again, or do you push through? And
no, you revert. At least in our case, we revert back to the old school. And so what we figured out is that it has a lot to do with neighborhood. So it's like, okay, so say you're trying to do analysis for a specific species, right? I'm going to use an example that we started with real early. It's this species called Australian tree fern, right? It's a big tree fern. Looks pretty similar to the native tree ferns we have here in Hawaii, but it's only pretty similar. It does look different, right? But it turns out it's kind of invasive, and it not kind of, it's pretty invasive, and it'll dominate the canopy in a bad way. We really want to try and manage for it, right? And so we were like, oh, great, we'll collect all this imagery, we'll do this, visual interpretation. And then, at some point, what we'll do is we'll use all this data that we've collected and done this visual interpretation. Now we have training data, right? We've got this huge data, so we can use to train. We'll dump it into a model, right? AI model. And then it's just going to pump out all this great results on the backside. And honestly, in some places, it worked really, really good, right? Because the tree species, the tree fern species on the island of Kauai, as an example, right? There wasn't a lot of overlap. They look pretty different. The native hapu that are here, right, don't really look like this Australian tree fern, right? Andropogon doesn't really look like it. And it worked pretty good. But then you take it to another island where there's a couple of different species of ferns that start looking really similar. All of a sudden, the model falls dead
And it
flat.
says the whole thing.
Yeah,
it's all invasive.
yeah, exactly, right. And then you got a bunch of false positives, right? And then you just wasted all your time. So what we figured out is that, and that's the deal with all the different species, right? Is that sometimes if the neighborhood is right, meaning our rule of thumb is like this: if you're going to do some sort of AI training model, right, then for you as an image interpreter, if you can look through the landscape and you could say, oh man, this is easy, I can always tell this thing apart from the neighbors around it, right? Then the chances that you're going to be able to make your AI model work really good, great. But if you're like, oh, I got to really think about it because I got to, is it north facing slope? Because I know if it's a south facing slope, it's probably not that particular. And I got to use all this kind of ancillary, monkey brain knowledge to understand that that's the species that I want. Then not a good idea for AI.
It's really interesting and very counterintuitive that it has to be a simple project for the really complicated machine learning model to do it right.
Yeah, because it turns out our brains are really still pretty specialized, right?
Yeah,
we're really good at working a lot of data problems. And
so where do you see this going? Do you see that gap bridging to where you will have to go old school less and less, and the model is going to get better and better, or do you think it's always going to kind of be in this complementary state?
You know what the deal is? We're in a technological, logarithmic
softball. I know what.
Yeah, no, it's definitely getting better all the time, man. I agree. Yeah, 1000%.
All right. So what else are you going to do with it? Or is that the plan? Is just to stay around here and map trees, or what else?
No, so it's
been doing, and
yeah.
Where do you see it going?
Yeah, no, that's where we started, right? Like I said, in 2008, but then, a series of years into it, we realized if we didn't diversify our product set and our clientele, that we were going to die as a company, right? So
you'll finish and
yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. And so we branched out, started working for all the usual suspects, the DO, everybody, DOI, DOT, DOE, do whatever, right?
Yeah.
And then, primarily we work, in throughout the Pacific. So mostly Hawaii, but then also Guam, Saipan, those kind of areas. We do some remote projects. Pretty cool, right?
Yeah,
and,
sure.
But then, again, recently merged with this company called ADS, Air Data Solutions on the mainland. And yeah, now we do all kinds of stuff, man. We do, large scale engineering projects. We do pipeline monitoring. We're all over the map, man. It's pretty fun.
Okay. So you've discussed satellite imagery in Hawaii being problematic at times.
Yeah.
Talked about the challenges of manned aerial flight. How about drones? You haven't talked at all about unmanned aerial vehicles. Are you using any kind of UAS or UAVs for your analysis?
Yeah, absolutely, man. I say absolutely, but the truth is that we don't use as much as we could, primarily because what we figured out, one is there's a lot of competition in space, right? It's the window to entry is much lower for drones, right? So you can go and buy a $5,000 drone and put a couple $1,000 sensor on it and do a bunch of work, right? Now, what we've also figured out is that obviously, like so many other folks, is that drones are fantastic if you're looking at a small scale, right? You're going to look at small area, relatively simple airspace, right? So as soon as you get into complex airspace, it gets more complicated, right? And so, yeah, we actually have a storage room full of drones, and we use them sometimes. But the way that we look at the mapping process is we say, okay, look, we go to a client and we're like, what do you need? What is your data product that you need? And then they tell us what their data product is, and we're like, great. Now we will decide for you what the cheapest way is to get that done. Right. And so if it's a drone, then we use a drone. If it's a manned aircraft, then we use a manned aircraft, right? Helicopter, air, fixed wing, whatever. And then we decide usually the approach. And that seems to be a pretty good way to do it, by not trying to be, we're agnostic on platform and sensor.
Not square hole or round peg, what sort of thing you get, like right tool, right trade, right?
Yep. Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
What do you think of the conference so far, and what are you getting out of it?
Yeah, no, it's awesome, man. Again, I've been in this state doing this stuff for 16 plus years. And the really cool thing about Hawaii compared to a lot of other places that I've lived and worked is that, because we're such a small state and we're also out in the middle of the Pacific, people have to work together more here, I think, than in some places, right? And so the fact that we have a conference like this where it's everybody in GIS and does the GIS work, and the state of Hawaii gets together here and does their thing. We have a lot of different conferences that are kind of similar to this, where you know, you have to work together. You have to pool money. You have to pool resources, or, you know, intellectual resources and whatever, in order to make things really work here well, because we are so remote and things are expensive and they're hard to do here. And so, yeah, no, it's great. And this conference has done nothing but grow, and lots of really great, you know, folks get together here and come up with awesome ideas to solve what are really complicated problems out in the middle of the ocean.
Cool stuff. Stephen, one last question. Curious your answer. We ask everybody this. Do you have a mantra that you live by?
A mantra that I live by?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I think the mantra that I'm thinking of right now that I think is pretty applicable is that change is the only constant, and so get used to it.
Well said.
Yeah, I can't
Here.
I can't top that. No.
Appreciate your time. Thanks for
boys.
coming by.
Thanks, Stephen. That was awesome.
See ya.
Cheers.
That was great.
Yeah, thanks.
You definitely got a cool story. Just totally random. The new like iPhone, when you take a picture now, the AI like functionality on your iPhone can literally do tree ID, plans ID. I'm testing it out.
Yeah, yeah.
Sometimes it's
Google
totally
Lens style.